Markel had been shot multiple times. The doctors wasn't working to repair, they was working to save his life.
They had to amputate one of his legs, and a day or two later, they had to amputate the other one.
There were 6 rounds fired in 11 seconds.
They immediately went on the run.
If they try to head to Mexico, they're just gone.
Not only has she moved on, he has embraced his children as his own.
Apparently, whenever they saw each other, it was a fight.
For every action, there's a reaction.
But this time, it ended in gunfire.
It's just after 10:33 p.m. on June 29, 2014, in the Atlanta suburb of College Park.
Atlanta's a mix. It's a little bit of everything. It's fun, it's hot, it's fast, culturally mixed and diverse. Atlanta is a lot of fun, but it's also a little scary. You don't know what you're going to encounter here.
College Park is on the borders of Atlanta and East Point. Basically, you have 2 parts of College Park. You had a historic section, which is over by downtown, and then you have the other section. The crime there is really kind of heavy.
On June 29, 2014, police received a lot of phone calls on 911 reference to a shooting that had just occurred at a Texaco there in College Park.
The shooting occurred at 11 p.m. on a Sunday evening during the summer, while a lot of people are out and partying in Atlanta. Callers are saying that the victim has been shot multiple times, but he's still breathing. So at this point, time is of the essence.
Officers with the College Park Police Department rushed to the location along with an ambulance.
A citizen was still helping the victim who was on the ground, putting pressure on a wound. He stayed doing that until rescue arrived.
Paramedics take over and begin first aid.
Uniformed patrol confirmed that it was a shooting, and at that point, they called for the criminal investigation division, and we went out. We reported this to the parking lot. Of course, with any scene like that, it was chaotic. The EMS was already on the scene, working on the victim. We saw that the victim was an African-American male, and he was shot in the torso. There was a lot of blood.
It started getting pretty hectic with onlookers and everyone just coming to see what happened.
Police were trying to determine who was a witness and who could give them any information. The gas station owner, he recognized the victim as a customer of his, 30-year-old Markel Dalco.
Markel, also known as Q, clings to life, but barely.
Emergency rescue personnel got him stabilized. They get him loaded in the ambulance, and that's when they head to the emergency room at the hospital.
Several of the onlookers also recognize the victim. They alert Markel's family.
My phone rings. It's his friend. And she said, Mr. Dalco, I gotta talk to you. Are you sitting down? Sitting down? What's wrong? She said, it's Q. I was like, what about Q? She said, I need you to sit down. I said, go ahead, man, I'm good. I said, what is it? She said, Q got shot. I said, well, is he okay? He's conscious, but he's not okay.
Markel Dalco was born at Atlanta's Grady Hospital to Michael Dalco and Denise McCoy on May 5th, 1984.
But I had a beautiful baby boy. I looked at him and I saw love.
Markel's parents were young and not prepared to raise a baby. So the job fell to his paternal grandmother, a pastor at an Atlanta church.
I'm 18, I didn't really have stable employment. She's finishing school. It just didn't seem like the right time. And that's when my mother stepped in. She actually said, if you have him, I'll raise him. And she did.
Markel, Dad and I did have a good relationship, but we was young, and so things didn't work out. I would see Markel all the time, even though his grandma raised him. We would spend a lot of time together because he still would come over on weekends. We went to the same church, so me and his father, we saw him all the time.
It was a very functional, dysfunctional family. You know, everything looked like it could easily fall apart. There was some fragility involved, but we all made it work. And I think Mom was the real anchor to all of that.
Early in life, Markel showed he had a natural talent that ran in his family.
Markel came from a very musical background. His mother was a singer, his dad was a singer-songwriter, and by the age of 4, Markel was playing the drums like an expert.
Markel was the church drummer. And I don't mean some little guy sitting up there where you go, oh, isn't he cute? No, I mean, if you look away, you forget there's a little child on the drum set. He was amazing.
He traveled a lot with his grandparents. They were in this gospel group, and they would take him on the road. So he would get up on the stage while they perform, and he would be in the back performing with them.
He struggled in school, but not because he was academically challenged. He was bored because Markel was a musician. We had to stop regular school for him, and my mother started homeschooling him. He went homeschool throughout high school, and then he went straight into music, rapping and producing and all of that.
College Park is a great place for up-and-coming artists. There's a lot of studios and a great place to network. And if you're an up-and-coming artist, it's where you want to be. A lot of rappers have come out of College Park, including Outkast, T.I., and 2 Chainz.
Markel was really trying to break into the rap industry. He was buying studio sessions, he was writing, he was spending all his spare time just to make his dream happen.
He could write raps just off the rip, and super talented in the studio. He walked in the studio and just everything made sense to him. He just had this knack for music, all things music.
Now in his early 20s, Markel was focused on his career. But he couldn't resist the distraction when he met a beautiful young woman.
Markel met Shanice Weaver, who is a single mother. She was beautiful, she was super charismatic, and they just hung out every single day after that. He really made it his duty to look after her and look out for the kids. They moved in together, and eventually Shanice became pregnant.
I was excited, and they already knew that it was gonna be a girl. We had so many boys in our family.
2 years after their first child was born, Markel and Shanice welcomed a second daughter.
Markel was ecstatic to be a girl dad and could not wait to take on the role.
But after several years together, the young parents hit a rough patch.
Like any young couple, financial stress can happen. So things at times got heated, there were arguments. Markel and Shanice's relationship just became more and more toxic. Not only were they fighting verbally, they were fighting physically almost every single day. And eventually Shanice just left. Markel and Shanice decided that they needed to just work on themselves. They still had to co-parent. That was just something difficult that they had to work through.
But the night of June 29th threatens to leave Markel's daughters without a father. After suffering multiple gunshot wounds, Markel is rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. College Park detectives question the growing crowd of onlookers at the gas station, searching for someone who witnessed the shooting.
We separated the witnesses because when you interview witnesses, you don't want them to hear each other because their story would be the same. So we separated them, and then we started working the scene.
There were 2 witnesses at the scene.
The witnesses tell police they are acquaintances of Markel. Not only do they know the victim, they witnessed what happened.
It was a fight.
According to the 2 witnesses, Markel got into a verbal argument with another man and a woman.
Everybody starts arguing, calling each other's name, using profanity.
Witness actually helped break up the fight.
But the altercation wasn't over.
After he broke up the fight, they were standing there, and the female walked over to the car, retrieved the handgun, came back and gave it to him.
The two witnesses report that things went from calm to chaos.
It escalates into something a lot more serious when you got a gun.
Atlanta detectives are at a College Park gas station where 30-year-old Markel Dalco was shot multiple times. With Markel en route to the hospital, two eyewitnesses explain that the shooting started as an argument between the victim, another man, and a woman.
Both witnesses said they saw the female suspect hand the male suspect a handgun. He walked over and shot the victim. And then at that point, they both left in a gold Crown Vic.
The witnesses are able to give another important detail.
Witnesses told police that the victim actually had a relationship with the female suspect. She was the mother of his two children. They told police that her name was Shanice.
As for the male suspect, the witnesses only know him as Shanice's man.
They just knew his name was Jay, and that was the new boyfriend.
They described Jay as over 6 feet tall with long dreadlocks. With two potential suspects, investigators continue the crime scene investigation.
The police found that there were 6 bullet holes in the window of the gas station, and 2 of the bullets were lodged in the wall.
Gas station employees pull footage from the store's surveillance system.
The employee of the gas station was able to provide video of the incident. Didn't catch the whole incident. It caught some of the fight. The fight went off screen, and then shortly after, you heard the gunshots. There were 6 rounds fired in 11 seconds.
And you don't actually see the shooting. You kind of see them arguing and whatever, and then they kind of move off camera, and you hear the gunshots.
The other thing the video doesn't show is a clear picture of the shooter's face. Detectives hope that Markel can help.
We had to go down to the hospital and talk to Mr. Dalco. We knew her name was Shanice, so we had to confirm that her name was Weaver.
They find Markel barely conscious and about to be wheeled into the operating room.
He gave us the information that the person involved in the shooting was his baby's mother, Miss Shanice Weaver.
As for the shooter, Markel doesn't know his name either.
Just knew his name was Jay, and that was the new boyfriend. And then he was rushed into surgery.
The surgeons start working on him. In fact, he was in surgery for 9 hours that evening.
Meanwhile, Markel's family has gathered at the hospital. As surgery gets underway, they wait with bated breath.
I remember a nurse coming out, and she said that Markel was in the operating room and that he had been shot multiple times, and pretty much the bullets had just ricocheted off of his organs. The doctors wasn't working to repair, they was working to save his life.
I thought he had been shot once. He had been shot 4 times.
And eventually a doctor came out and told us what had happened. And they had said that he had passed, on the way, but they, brought him back. And he passed 2 more times on the table, and they brought him back. They said they thought they was done, but he started bleeding internally, so they had to go back and rush him, so they left us like that. So I was a wreck when I found out about that. Like, my heart dropped, because that's one of the worst things that a mother want to hear.
Investigators leave the hospital to look for Shanice and her mysterious lover, Jay.
She lived actually close by to the area where the shooting occurred at. We knocked on the door. Miss Weaver wasn't there.
The police go to Shanice Weaver's mother's house, trying to find her. Maybe she's there. The mother tells them she has no idea where she's at.
Investigators fear the worst.
It doesn't take long to flee and get out of state. You can be out of state within an hour or so. The challenge then becomes, where did they go? How do you find them?
After Markel Dalco is shot 4 times in a gas station parking lot, he is left fighting for his life at an Atlanta hospital. College Park detectives are on the hunt for 2 suspects: the mother of Markel's 2 daughters, Shanice Weaver, and her new boyfriend, known only as Jay. Detectives are unable to locate either suspect and fear they may have fled the Atlanta area.
She never went back home. I think they probably immediately went on the run after the shooting.
So now, Shanice and her new boyfriend are both fugitives from justice.
Investigators issue a be on the lookout for Shanice, her boyfriend, and the gold Crown Victoria they are suspected to be driving.
When you get suspect information, either their names or type of vehicle, that information is typically dispatched over the air to all local law enforcement.
Shanice's phone appears to confirm that the couple is on the run.
They started doing what we call pinging her phone, and you can see the phone moving, headed to California. We notified the U.S. Marshals. That's what we do when people cross over to another jurisdiction. We notify the Marshals, and the Marshals immediately start working on it.
The day after the shooting, Markel's father contacts police, letting them know he located a picture of Shanice and the mysterious Jay on social media.
We pulled it off and put it on our bolo.
The be on the lookout gets attention from an unexpected source: Shanice.
College Park police obtained a picture of Shanice and posted it on their website about her being wanted.
Once we put out the bolo, she found out that it was out there, and she immediately went on and started to taunt us.
That spurred Shanice to make a comment on their post saying, well, at least you got a good picture of me.
One of her public posts actually said, at least my mugshot is cute.
For the next week, Shanice and her lover remain on the run. Markel's family stays in touch with the police. While they don't know why Shanice and Jay would make an attempt on Markel's life, they acknowledge that he didn't have a great relationship with his ex.
Markel and Shanice were known to have a very tumultuous relationship. It got volatile at times in public, and people knew just by their relationship that they were constantly fighting.
The family also updates investigators on Markel's condition.
It was touch and go for some days. I mean, he was in a coma. It was back and forth. One day it was good news, the next day it was bad news. 1 minute it's good news, the next minute it's bad news. So it was a roller coaster, emotional roller coaster.
A week after the shooting, Markel is still in a coma. Doctors tell his family they must make a decision that will both save Markel's life and change it forever.
There was this one point in it where we thought we were losing him. The compressions weren't working. His feet are turning black because of no blood flow. One side was worse than the other. They said we need to do an amputation because if we don't, that poison will get through his bloodstream and he'll die.
First they was saying that they was gonna have to amputate one. And then it came back and said they had to amputate both. And so they asked us to make one of the hardest decisions that we had to make, because you're making a decision for somebody that don't have a voice for their self. And they said, do you want to take life over limbs, a limb over life. And we had to make the decision to choose life over limb.
They had to amputate one of his legs. And a day or two later, they had to amputate the other one. So now he's a double amputee.
A local news station runs an update on Markel's story, asking the public's help in locating the two suspects and the Gold Crown Victoria they're believed to be driving. A day later, detectives get a call from an unlikely source, a member of Jay's family.
Police found out that Shanice's new boyfriend was actually Jonathan Bankston.
Jonathan's family reports to police that the 31-year-old has been checking in since hitting the road with Shanice.
The reason Jonathan's family was helping the police find him, they were worried because of the seriousness of the crime that something may go bad, and they didn't want him to get hurt or shot by the police. His welfare is more important to them. They wanted him caught before something bad could happen.
Jonathan's family doesn't know where the couple is, but they promise to let police know if they hear more. Investigators don't have to wait long for news on the couple. The longer Shanice goes without getting caught, the more she posts.
After Shanice made her initial post, that kind of spurred her to start making other social media posts. She was posting her location, she was saying things to taunt the police, she was even going back and forth with the victim's uncle, taunting him.
It was almost fun for them. There was an attitude of maybe even being above the law. It seemed like it was an adventure and a Bonnie and Clyde duo and Catch Me If You Can.
After the near-fatal shooting of Markel Dalco, the mother of his two children, Shanice Weaver, and her new boyfriend, Jonathan Bankston, hit the road.
To know that the people that did it was on the run, I want them to be found, and I want them to be brought to justice.
Having eluded law enforcement for over a week, Shanice grows bolder by the day as she continues to post on social media.
Usually when people go on the run, they are hiding, they're afraid, they don't want to be seen, they don't want to be noticed. You expect to disappear and fall off the radar completely, but what's interesting about these two is that wasn't the case.
She struck me as being a person that liked the limelight, and she figured that was the way to get it by going on her social media page and taunting us. That was the first time that I had anybody to actually tell me and taunt me on social media to come get them.
It might be a little frustrating, but what it also does, it motivates us. We're like, okay, you want to play this game? We're going to play this game with you.
Unbeknownst to the couple, both Jonathan and Shanice's friends and family back in Atlanta begin working with police.
A lot of times suspects will call back to the area where the crime happened just to see what's going on, to see if anybody has any information.
Shanice started calling people from California. So it was actually some friends or relatives of hers that actually said, yeah, they're in California.
Investigators fear the lovers may have their sights set on Mexico.
If they try to head to Mexico, it's not too hard to get in, they're just gone.
Once they cross that border, there's no telling when they get caught.
On July 9th, 2014, 11 days after the shooting, one of Jonathan Bankston's family members calls police. The relative informs them that Jonathan just made plans to meet his aunt for a meal in Los Angeles.
At that point, the U.S. Marshals zoomed in on that restaurant.
Shanice and Jonathan thought distance mattered. They were 2,000 miles away from the scene of the crime. But in today's life, with the internet and communications, that distance doesn't mean a whole lot.
Thinking they are about to break bread with Jonathan's aunt, instead, Shanice and Jonathan are met by members of the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force.
Just 11 days after they were on their run, Police set up a sting operation, and they were able to catch Miss Weaver and Mr. Bankston.
With her being arrested in California, we didn't actually fly anybody out there to interview her. We just waited for her to be extradited back to Atlanta.
Once they were taken in custody by the U.S. Marshals and local law enforcement in California, after the court proceedings were done, the U.S. Marshals escorted Shanice and Jonathan back to Georgia.
Jonathan and Shanice are charged with aggravated assault.
When we learned that they had been caught, it was a relief because we went a week not knowing where they are. Are they still in town? Is he in danger? We didn't know. So to find out that they had been caught, that's one less thing we had to worry about.
After the arrests, Atlanta investigators finally get the chance to sit down with the couple. The biggest question still looming over the investigation is why. Shanice isn't saying.
Amazingly, with her ton nuts, when she got back to Georgia, she wasn't very talkative and she lawyered up. When we went to attempt to interview her, she invoked her right to an attorney. And once she invokes her right to an attorney, we can't talk to her anymore unless she called us to talk.
They have no better luck with Jonathan.
He was more of a follower, and he kind of followed her lead, so he lawyered up also.
Neither Jonathan nor Shanice are talking. But there is one person who might still be able to shed light on the truth.
I turns around, and when I turn around, I see him pointing a gun at me. So I say, you know, you point that gun at me, you better kill me.
With Shanice Weaver and Jonathan Bankston lawyered up and behind bars, the one person left who can shed light on why Markel Dalco was shot is Markel himself. Three weeks after the shooting and following a double amputation, Markel wakes up.
We was happy that he opened his eyes up, but when he started trying to feel for his legs, that was rough. Like, I'm turning my head trying to keep from crying so he won't see the tears. And he's looking scared because he's trying to figure out what's going on, you know, where his legs at. So that was kind of like a bittersweet thing because you're happy that he's awake and, you know, you're excited he's still here. But then the bitter part is he's realizing he's not whole anymore.
When I first woke up, I was just actually happy to be alive. Because my whole life, I never feared death. I always felt like either you live or you die, you know what I mean? Live your life to the fullest in between.
He just dealt with it so graciously, and I was devastated. I was devastated.
Investigators visit him at the hospital. Markel explains that the tension between himself and Jonathan started when his kids began referring to Jonathan as their stepfather.
Yeah, but like, my kids don't need no stepdaddy, you know what I mean? They got a good father right here. I know you trying to make me jealous. And that's where our beef started. Every time we'd see each other, it was something, you know what I mean? To the point where when we started having separate birthday parties and stuff for the kids and stuff, because we couldn't all be in a room together.
Apparently, whenever they saw each other, it was a fight.
It's like every time I see him, it'll be an issue. We either running him off the block or I tell my people, like, y'all see this dude anywhere, you know what I mean? Don't even let him feel comfortable out here because we don't even get along like that. And that was my way of not going to the next level, you know what I mean? Just keeping him away from me.
Markel tells police the situation came to a head when he ran into Shanice and Jonathan at the gas station on the night of June 29th.
Pulled up to the pump. I seen him coming out the store. So I had my gun too, but I took my gun out and put it up under the seat. And I went in and addressed him, you know what I mean? We had words back and forth, and we got into an altercation, a fight.
Markel's friend broke up the fight, but the violence wasn't over.
I heard like the gun cock. And he just started shooting after that. He missed like the first 4 or 5 shots, to the point where I didn't think he was trying to shoot me. I thought he was just trying to scare me. So at that point, I was kind of like taunting him at that point, beating on my chest and throwing up my set and talking junk or whatever. But them next 4 bullets, they hit. I got hit 4 times, one in both legs, one in my stomach, and one like 3 inches away from my heart. I fell all the way back into the glass of the store behind me and shattered the glass and hit the ground.
The gunfire stopped, and Markel realized something terrible had just happened.
And I was like, I can't get up, there's something wrong with my legs. I was like, call the ambulance and tell them hurry up. And after that, I don't remember nothing else because I actually blacked out.
Markel may have wanted payback against Jonathan because Jonathan had stepped up as the father of his children, and Markel had threatened Jonathan before. And on this night, Markel actually became the victim of him wanting payback because he ended up being the one shot.
As usual, it was a fight, but this time it ended in gunfire.
People that pull the trigger, most of them don't even think about the consequences. They don't realize what they're doing at the time. A lot of it is ego, and they've made threats, and they just pull the trigger. And they find out later there's serious consequences.
While most of Markel's story falls in line with what investigators already know, there is one key detail that differs when it comes to Shanice.
A lot of people say that she actually passed him the gun, but I didn't see her pass him the gun.
Following their arrests on July 10, 2014, Shanice Weaver and Jonathan Bankston faced charges in the shooting that almost claimed the life of Shanice's ex-boyfriend, Markel Dalco.
I remember speaking with the DA, and, we talked about going for aggravated assault. And for each limb that my brother lost, that's a charge. He lost his legs, that's a charge. If he lose anything internally, that's a charge.
That's about as serious as you can get. And fortunately, the victim in this case didn't die. Otherwise the charges would have been escalated to murder.
Shanice and her defense attorney weigh her chances at trial.
They were taunting the police like, you can't catch me, that kind of thing. They can use that all against you in a court of law when it comes time to hear your case. And so therefore, what does that do? That just makes everybody mad, and obviously that could be enhance your sentence, getting a few more years because you're acting that way.
With the trial looming and her fate hanging in the balance, Shanice makes a decision.
Her record was not anything significant. So as a result of that, I was able to negotiate with the district attorney's office to work out a plea.
In turn, Shanice admits to playing a role in the shooting.
She had 2 children at the time with the victim. She, of course, at this time had a new boyfriend. So you had these 3 people, they all gotten into an argument. It was just a 3-ring circus, really.
As Markel also reported, Shanice claims she did not hand the gun to Jonathan. But that doesn't mean she is without blame for what happened next.
She got mad and upset. She told her boyfriend, go to the car, get the gun. And he went to the car and did get the gun. He ended up coming back with the gun and then ultimately shooting the alleged victim several times. She was, at that point in time, she was remorseful and sorry that it had happened, but she just made some bad decisions and bad judgment in this particular case.
Shanice pleads guilty to aggravated assault, aggravated battery, and 1 count of possession of a firearm in the commission of a crime.
At that time, there was a law in effect that if you had no prior felony convictions, you could enter a plea under the First Offender Act, and so that's what we were able to do in this particular case because she had no prior record.
Shanice Weaver was sentenced to 2 years in prison and 20 years probation.
Jonathan Bankston pleads guilty to 5 counts of aggravated assault and aggravated battery. He receives a much stiffer sentence, 20 years.
The boyfriend was the one that actually pulled the trigger. Anytime you have a gun involved in aggravated assault, now you're looking at 20 years. So that's the reason why he got the sentence he got, is because they're going to really take that extra seriously when you got weapons involved.
For Markel's family, the sentences bring little in the way of comfort.
To be honest with you, and I'm speaking honestly, I felt bad for him. I felt bad for my son because it was 2 lives destroyed. Like, to me, neither one of them have the life that they used to have.
Like, what did any of this accomplish? Okay, so you got to shoot him. Okay, you got to take a bullet. You're tough. Okay, you're tough. Okay, now you're in a wheelchair. You're in prison. Your dad is without his son. We all lost. Markel lost. Shanice lost. My granddaughters lost. My son's mother lost. I lost. The shooter boy lost. His father lost. Their family lost.
And I understand for every action, there's a reaction. There's consequences. And I think both of them are, looking back, there's probably different decisions that both of them probably would have made.
Years after he was shot, Markel Dalco still deals with the consequences of that 11 seconds of gunfire every day.
I was in the hospital for like about 8 to 10 months until they finally let me go home after I got shot. But it was a lot. I went through, like, at that time, it was probably about 50 or 60 surgeries. At that time, I'm up to about 80 now. Sometimes I feel like I would have rather died after, most of the stuff I had been through. And wondering, asking God, why am I here? You know what I mean? So, yeah.
As it all turned out, maybe a few months later, it seemed like it would have been better if he had died because of what he started going through. It was the worst thing that could ever happen to a person without dying. Death would have been like a relief. It was turmoil from that night till now. It has never ceased. It's not worth it. On both sides, to the gentleman that shot him, to my son who got shot, both of their lives were devastated.
Shanice completes her prison sentence in 2016, prompting an unlikely reconciliation between her and Markel.
She was there, and she was explaining to me or whatever that she was afraid and kind of in shock, and when he drove off with her still in the car, she didn't know what to do after that, and she was kind of shocked because she didn't know if I lived through that or died. I mean, so we done talked about it. We done got past it. Though I still love her to this day, she still loves me. We still there for each other, but it's better off for us to be just co-parent. We got a great co-parenting relationship. It's still love. It's always going to be.
The first thing you need to understand about the Belcher Islands is that there are places on Earth where the landscape itself seems to resist human life. In winter, the islands disappear beneath a world of white and blue. The horizon becomes almost impossible to separate from the sky. Snow covers the ground until every familiar path, every rock, every trace of human movement can vanish beneath the same frozen surface. The sea that surrounds the islands is no longer simply water. It becomes an enormous sheet of ice, stretching toward the horizon, beautiful from a distance and deadly up close. In 1941, there were no highways leading into this place. No telephone network connecting one settlement to another. No ambulance waiting nearby. No police station with officers ready to respond within minutes. If something terrible happened on the Belcher Islands, the outside world might not hear about it for days, or even weeks. And that winter, something terrible did happen. People began to die. At first, the deaths seemed like tragedies that could be explained by the harshness of the Arctic. A person could disappear while hunting. A storm could overwhelm a traveler. A mistake on the ice could become fatal within minutes. In a place where temperatures could turn exposed skin into an injury and where survival depended on experience, death was never a distant possibility. But these deaths were different. Some people were not dying because they had become lost. They were dying because other people had decided that they should die. And behind those decisions was an idea so powerful, so frightening, and so difficult to understand that it would eventually transform an isolated Arctic community into the center of one of the strangest criminal investigations in Canadian history. There were people who believed that they had received a divine revelation. There were people who believed they were more than ordinary human beings. There were accusations involving Jesus Christ. There were accusations involving Satan. There were gatherings where spiritual claims became more than words. And eventually, there were bodies. Among those caught inside the nightmare was a girl named Sarah Aporcock. She was only about 13 years old. A child. Her life had been lived in a world where survival demanded strength, where families depended on one another, and where the distance between safety and catastrophe could be measured in a single step across the ice. Yet in January of 1941, Sarah found herself at the center of a terrifying religious conflict. According to the surviving accounts, she was accused of being connected to Satan. The accusation was not simply an insult or a passing superstition. It became something far more dangerous. In the minds of those who believed it, Sarah had become a symbol of evil. And once a human being is transformed into a symbol of evil, ordinary rules can begin to disappear. The question is no longer, what has this person actually done? The question becomes, what must be done to protect everyone else from them? That is where fear becomes dangerous. That is where belief can become violence. And that is where this story begins. But Sarah was not the only person who died. In the months that followed, the number of dead grew. 3 Inuit people were killed during the earlier violence connected with the religious movement. Then, in March, an entirely different kind of horror unfolded on the frozen surface of Hudson Bay. 6 people went out onto the ice. Among them were children. Moses was 13. Alec Umaraluk was 8. Jonassy was only 6. Johnny Cockpuck was 7. There was also a 55-year-old man named Nukarak. And a 32-year-old woman named Kumudluk Sarah. They did not go onto the ice because they were fleeing an invading army. They were not trapped there by a shipwreck. They were not caught by accident in a sudden expedition gone wrong. They went out because someone had convinced them that they should. The date was March 29, 1941. The Arctic winter had not yet released its grip. The ice still dominated the landscape. And somewhere out there, beyond the safety of shelter, a group of human beings walked into a place where the cold did not care what they believed. Imagine the scene. There is no city in sight. No road. No warm building rising above the horizon. Only the enormous frozen expanse of Hudson Bay. The people moving across it would have appeared impossibly small against the landscape. The children would have had to walk through conditions their bodies were never meant to endure for long without adequate protection. Every step carried them farther from warmth, farther from shelter, farther from the possibility of rescue. And yet they continued. Perhaps some believed they were following a religious promise. Perhaps some did not fully understand what was happening. Perhaps others simply trusted the adults around them. That distinction matters. Because when we look backward at historical crimes, it is tempting to imagine that every person involved understood the situation exactly as we do now. They did not. They were living inside the moment. Inside the belief. Inside the fear. Inside the community. And when a person is surrounded by people repeating the same extraordinary claim, when that claim is presented as divine truth, and when disagreement is framed as evidence of evil, the pressure to conform can become enormous. The children on the ice could not know what historians would later write about them. They could not know that their names would survive in police files and government records. They could not know that decades later, people would still ask how such a thing could have happened. They only knew the people beside them. They knew the cold. They knew the journey. And eventually, they knew that something had gone terribly wrong. 6 of them would not return. Their deaths would become part of the official count of 9 victims connected to the Belcher Islands murders. 9 lives. 9 people who would never return to their families. 9 human beings whose deaths became tangled with a story that newspapers far away would struggle to explain. But even the number 9 does not fully describe what happened. Because this was not one murder scene. It was not one killer walking into one building. It was not a single moment of violence that could be neatly marked on a calendar. It was a chain. One belief led to another. One accusation fed another. One act of violence made the next act easier to imagine. And in a remote community surrounded by ice, there was nowhere for the consequences to hide. The outside world eventually gave the case a name, the Belcher Island murders. But the people living there did not experience it as a historical case. They experienced it as the loss of neighbors, friends, parents, children, relatives. People they had known before the fear began. That is important to remember, because the distance of time can make historical victims feel unreal. A name on a page becomes a statistic. A number in a report becomes 9. But Sarah Aporcock was not victim number 4. She was a 13-year-old girl. Moses was not simply another name among the dead. He was 13 years old too. Alec was 8. Jonassy was 6. Johnny was 7. These were children who should have been learning, playing, hunting with their families, growing into adults, and building lives of their own. Instead, their lives ended in a landscape that could swallow a person without leaving much behind. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the story is that the people responsible did not necessarily see themselves as villains. That is what makes this case so disturbing. Criminal history is often easier to understand when greed, revenge, jealousy, or hatred provides an obvious motive. A person wants money. A person wants revenge. A person wants power. A person wants someone else gone. Those motives are terrible, but they are recognizable. The Belcher Islands case is harder. Because some of the people involved believed they were acting according to a higher truth. Peter Salar was one of the central figures. Charlie, or Charlie, Uyarak, was another. Uyarak was described as a powerful influence within the group and was associated with claims of a divine identity, including the belief that he was Jesus. Salar was also associated with extraordinary spiritual claims. To modern ears, such beliefs may sound impossible. But belief does not need to sound reasonable to the person who holds it. A belief can become real enough to dictate behavior. Real enough to determine who is trusted. Real enough to determine who is feared. And, in the darkest circumstances, real enough to determine who lives and who dies. That is the psychological doorway into the Belcher Islands case. The people involved were not living in a vacuum. They were living through an exceptionally difficult winter in an isolated Arctic environment. Food could be scarce. Travel was dangerous. Communication with the outside world was painfully limited. The community existed at a great distance from the centers of Canadian government. And Christianity itself had become part of the cultural landscape through decades of contact, missionary activity, trade, and colonial influence. These forces did not automatically produce violence. Most people living under those conditions did not become murderers. That distinction is essential. The Arctic did not cause the murders. Inuit culture did not cause the murders. Religion itself did not cause the murders. What happened was the convergence of extreme isolation, hardship, social tension, individual beliefs, psychological disturbance, and the dangerous authority claimed by certain individuals. Somewhere inside that convergence, a line was crossed. And once it was crossed, people began to die. When news of the killings eventually reached Canadian authorities, the response itself became extraordinary. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had to travel hundreds of miles into one of the most remote inhabited regions in the country. This was not a conventional investigation. There was no urban crime scene. No network of nearby roads. No crowd of witnesses waiting outside a police station. The investigators had to enter a landscape where weather could dictate whether an aircraft could fly, where distance could turn a routine logistical problem into a life-threatening emergency, and where the physical environment was itself an obstacle. An RCMP team, accompanied by medical and communications personnel, was sent north. They were not simply going to investigate suspicious deaths. They were going into a community where the boundaries between religion, authority, fear, illness, and criminal responsibility had become blurred. And when they arrived, they would discover that the story they had heard from a distance was only part of the truth. The investigation would uncover a series of deaths rather than one massacre. The witnesses would tell stories that sounded unbelievable. The accused would offer explanations rooted in spiritual conviction. And the investigators would have to answer a question that remains uncomfortable even today. When someone genuinely believes that they are acting on divine orders, what happens when that belief leads directly to the death of another human being? Is it murder? Is it madness? Is it both? And how does a court decide? In the summer of 1941, the Canadian government would eventually bring the machinery of justice into the same frozen world where the crimes had occurred. A tent would become a courtroom. People from the outside world would sit beside people from the community. A judge would preside over proceedings thousands of miles from the familiar centers of Canadian legal authority. The accused would stand before the law. And the dead, who could no longer speak for themselves, would be represented by evidence, testimony, memory, and the names left behind in official records. Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak would ultimately be convicted of manslaughter. Their sentences would be only 2 years in prison with hard labor. Another individual would receive a 1-year sentence. Others would be released. Mina, the woman associated with the fatal journey onto the ice, would be judged mentally ill rather than treated as an ordinary criminal defendant. For a modern audience, those outcomes can feel startlingly small compared with the scale of the tragedy. 9 deaths. Children among them. A community traumatized. And yet the principal sentences were measured in years. That contrast is part of what makes the case so difficult to leave behind. But before we reach the courtroom, before the investigators arrive, before the witnesses speak, before the judge weighs responsibility, we need to return to the beginning. Before the bodies were counted. Before the names appeared in police records. Before the frozen bay became a grave. There was a community living through another winter. People woke each day to the same immense horizon. They hunted. They traveled. They gathered. They cared for their families. They survived. And somewhere among them, ideas were spreading. Ideas about salvation. Ideas about Jesus. Ideas about Satan. Ideas about who possessed spiritual authority. Ideas about who was chosen. And ideas about who was dangerous. At first, perhaps, they were only words. A strange claim made by one person. A conversation in a shelter. A religious gathering. A disagreement. A warning. Then someone was accused. Then someone was killed. And after the first blood was spilled, the world inside the community could never be exactly the same. Because violence changes the meaning of everything that comes after it. A threat becomes more believable. A rumor becomes more dangerous. Silence becomes suspicious. And fear begins to move from one person to another. By the time the 6 people walked onto the ice in March, the tragedy had already been building for months. They were not the beginning. They were not the end. They were the most visible victims of a chain of events that had begun in the human mind long before it reached the frozen surface of Hudson Bay. And that is why the Belcher Islands murders are more than a story about death in the Arctic. They are a story about what happens when isolation gives fear room to grow. About what happens when certainty becomes stronger than evidence. About what happens when a person claims to speak for God, and others decide to believe them. And about what can happen when a frightened community loses the ability to tell the difference between spiritual conviction and dangerous delusion. In the end, the ice would remain. The wind would continue to cross the bay. The seasons would change. Summer would eventually return to the islands. But the people who walked onto that ice would not return with it. Their names would remain in the record. Sarah Aporcock, Moses, Alec Umaralek, Jonasi, Johnny Cockpuck, Nukarak, Kumudluk Sarah, and the others whose deaths formed the darker beginning of the case. 9 lives. 9 absences. 9 families forced to continue living in a place where every familiar path could lead back to a memory of someone who was no longer there. And decades later, when we look back at the Belcher Islands in 1941, the most frightening question is not simply who killed whom. It is how ordinary human beings can become convinced that something extraordinary is true. How a belief can become a weapon. How a community can become trapped inside that belief. And how, in a landscape so vast that a single human figure can disappear against the horizon, the smallest decisions can have consequences that reach across generations. This is the story of the Belcher Islands murders. And to understand how 9 people came to die, we must first go back to the frozen world they called home, before anyone knew that the winter of 1941 would become a chapter in Canadian criminal history. But there is another reason the Belcher Islands story has endured. It is not simply because the deaths were unusual. It is because, beneath every strange detail, there was something painfully ordinary. People wanted to understand what was happening around them. They wanted to know whom they could trust. They wanted protection. They wanted answers. And in a place where the outside world was unimaginably far away, answers could come from the person standing closest to you. That person might be a family member, a respected member of the community, a spiritual leader, or someone who simply spoke with enough confidence that others began to listen. That is how influence often works. It does not always arrive as a command. Sometimes it begins as reassurance. A person says that they understand what is happening. They say that they know why suffering has come. They say they have been chosen to explain it. And when people are frightened, exhausted, isolated, or desperate for certainty, a confident explanation can feel like safety. Even when it is wrong. Even when it is dangerous. The Belcher Islands in 1941 were a world where survival depended heavily on knowledge passed from one generation to another. Knowing how to read the weather mattered. Knowing the ice mattered. Knowing where animals could be found mattered. Knowing when to travel and when to stay home could mean the difference between life and death. In such an environment, experience carried enormous authority. So when religious authority became mixed with claims of supernatural power, the consequences could be profound. The people who gathered around Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak were not stepping into a story that they knew would end in murder. There was no warning written across the beginning of the year. No one could look at the first religious gathering and say, "This is where the tragedy begins." History does not work that way. The danger usually becomes visible only after the fact. A conversation that seemed strange becomes important later. A belief that seemed harmless becomes a clue. A disagreement that seemed personal becomes the first sign of something larger. And when investigators eventually reconstruct the sequence, they have to walk backward through all those moments, searching for the point where ordinary life gave way to something else. That task would be especially difficult in the Belcher Islands. The physical landscape did not preserve evidence in the way a city does. Snow could cover a trail. Wind could erase footprints. Ice could conceal the boundary between land and water. Time could transform a crime scene before anyone even knew a crime had occurred. And witnesses were not standing outside a police station waiting to provide statements. They were living inside the same community. They knew the people involved. They had their own fears, their own beliefs, their own memories. Some had lost relatives. Some had witnessed disturbing events. Some had participated in the religious gatherings. Some may have believed what the accused believed. Others may have been terrified of them. Every testimony therefore had to be understood within a community that had already experienced something extraordinary. The investigators were not arriving at the beginning of the story. They were arriving after the damage had already been done. And there is a particular cruelty in arriving late. By then, the dead cannot explain what they saw. They cannot correct a witness. They cannot tell investigators whether they were frightened, confused, willing, or forced. They cannot describe the final moments in their own words. The living have to speak for them. And the living do not always remember the same thing. This is one of the central problems in any historical investigation. Memory is not a photograph. It changes. Fear changes it. Grief changes it. Time changes it. The desire to protect someone changes it. The desire to punish someone can change it too. In a small isolated community, where almost everyone knows almost everyone else, testimony carries another burden. The person sitting across from an investigator is not describing a stranger. They may be describing a neighbor, a relative, a friend, or someone they will have to see again after the police leave. That reality matters. Because the investigators could leave. The community could not. The police would eventually return south. The aircraft would disappear over the horizon. The officials would write their reports. The newspapers would print their stories. The courtroom would close. But the people of the Belcher Islands would remain with the memory. They would remain with the empty places, the missing voices, the questions, and the knowledge that people they had once known had become part of something they could scarcely explain. That is the human dimension often lost when this case is reduced to the phrase Belcher Islands massacre. A massacre sounds like a single event, a single location, a single burst of violence. But the Belcher Islands tragedy unfolded differently. It was fragmented. There were separate deaths, separate decisions, separate moments of fear. And among them was a sequence of events that eventually led to the deaths on the ice. The frozen journey of March 29th is particularly difficult to understand because the ice itself seems almost symbolic. For generations, Arctic people had depended upon ice. It could be a road. It could connect communities. It could provide access to hunting grounds. It could make travel possible across distances that would otherwise be impossible. But ice has no loyalty. The same surface that carries a person safely one day can become a grave another day. On that March day, 6 people entered that dangerous landscape. Children were among them. That fact alone changes the emotional weight of the story. An adult can make a decision and accept the consequences. A child depends upon adults to recognize danger. A 6-year-old does not have the life experience necessary to understand the full meaning of a religious prophecy or a dangerous journey across an Arctic bay. An 8-year-old cannot be expected to weigh the authority of an adult against the physical evidence of freezing weather. A 13-year-old may understand fear, but understanding fear is not the same as having the power to resist it. And so, when we imagine those children on the ice, we should be careful not to imagine them as participants in some abstract historical event. Imagine instead the simple human reality. A child walking beside adults. A small figure moving across an enormous white surface. Perhaps looking toward the people leading the way. Perhaps wondering how much farther they would have to go. Perhaps believing that the adults knew where they were going. The Arctic does not announce death with a dramatic gesture. Sometimes there is no obvious moment when everything changes. Cold works quietly. It takes strength gradually. The body becomes exhausted. Movement becomes more difficult. Judgment begins to fail. The distance back to shelter becomes greater with every minute. And once a person becomes too weak to continue, the environment becomes almost impossible to fight. For the 6 people who died that day, the journey ended there. For their families, it did not. Their deaths became a wound that remained after the bodies were recovered. And then there was the question of why. Why had they gone? Why had they followed? Who had convinced them? What had they been promised? What did they believe would happen? And who had understood the danger before it was too late? Those questions would become part of the investigation. But another question was waiting behind them. What had happened before? Because the deaths on the ice did not exist by themselves. They were connected to the earlier violence. Connected to the religious movement. Connected to accusations. Connected to the strange claims surrounding Salah and Uyarak. And connected to Sarah Aporcock. Sarah's story is especially disturbing because of her age. A 13-year-old girl had somehow become the target of a belief system in which supernatural evil was no longer an invisible theological concept. It had been given a human face. Her face. According to the surviving accounts, Sarah was accused of being associated with Satan. The accusation would have been terrifying under any circumstances. But in an isolated community, surrounded by people who believed the accusation, there was little room for an accused person to escape the consequences of the label. Once a person is described as evil, everything they do can be interpreted through that belief. If they become frightened, that fear can be interpreted as guilt. If they protest, the protest can be interpreted as deception. If they remain silent, the silence can be interpreted as evidence. The accusation becomes impossible to disprove because every reaction is absorbed into the accusation itself. This is one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms in persecution. The victim is no longer treated as a person. They become an explanation. A container into which fear can be placed. Sarah did not need to be guilty of anything. The belief itself could become sufficient. And that is why the story should not be told merely as an exotic tale of Arctic superstition. Doing so would miss the deeper human pattern. Societies throughout history have created enemies out of people who were accused of being possessed, cursed, heretical, dangerous, impure, or aligned with supernatural evil. The setting changes. The language changes. The beliefs change. But the mechanism can remain remarkably similar. Fear searches for a target. Authority gives the fear a name. The group accepts the name. And eventually, the target is treated as though the accusation itself were proof. The Belcher Islands case gives us a particularly stark example because the environment was so isolated and the consequences were so severe. There was no easy escape. No neighboring town. No outside institution arriving immediately to challenge the claims. No modern communications network. When an idea gained influence, it could spread within the community without immediate contradiction from the outside world. That does not mean everyone believed it. They did not. But the people who did believe it could become increasingly convinced that they were surrounded by others who shared their understanding. And perceived agreement can be powerful. A person who is uncertain alone may become confident when surrounded by 10 people repeating the same claim. The claim does not become more true. But it feels more true. This is how collective certainty can form. And once certainty hardens, doubt becomes dangerous. A person who questions the leader may be accused of questioning God. A person who rejects the prophecy may be accused of rejecting salvation. A person who refuses to participate may be treated as an enemy. The line between disagreement and betrayal begins to disappear. That is the psychological landscape in which the Belcher Islands murders unfolded. And there is something else we must remember. The people involved were not living in an ordinary modern environment. They were living in the Arctic in the early 20th century. The Canadian state was present, but its presence was distant. Government authority, law enforcement, commerce, and missionary influence had all reached the region, but the institutions that existed elsewhere in Canada were not physically close. The people of the islands were not surrounded by hospitals, courts, schools, police departments, and government offices. Distance mattered. Weather mattered. Transportation mattered. A government decision made hundreds of miles away could take time to reach the people it affected. And a cry for help could take even longer to reach the government. That distance would become crucial when the authorities finally learned what had happened. When the RCMP arrived, they would have to reconstruct events that had unfolded over months. They would have to determine who had died, how they had died, who had been present, what had been said, who had encouraged whom, who had acted directly, and perhaps most difficult of all, what each person had believed at the time. The investigation would therefore become more than a search for physical evidence. It would become a search for motive, a search for mental state, a search for responsibility, and ultimately, a search for the boundary between belief and criminal intent. Those questions would eventually follow the accused into court. But the courtroom was still far away. For now, the islands remained in winter. The dead were dead. The living were left behind. And the outside world knew almost nothing. That silence would not last forever. Eventually, information began to travel south. A report reached authorities. The story was alarming enough to require action. The RCMP prepared to go north. And suddenly, the remote community that had existed beyond the attention of most Canadians became the subject of an investigation that would attract national and international attention. Newspapers would struggle to describe what had happened. Some reports would exaggerate the number of victims. Some would use language that reflected the prejudices of the period. Some would portray the events as a bizarre curiosity from a distant Arctic world. But behind the headlines were real people. Real families. Real grief. And a community trying to make sense of death. This is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because when the outside world finally looked toward the Belcher Islands, it did not necessarily see the community as the people living there saw it. Journalists wanted a dramatic story. Authorities wanted facts. The courts wanted responsibility. Historians would later want context. But the victims needed something none of those institutions could fully provide. They needed to be remembered as people. That is why their names matter. Moses. Alec Umaralek. Jonassy. Johnny Cockpuck. Nukarak. Kumudluk Sarah. Sarah Aporcock. These names are more important than the sensational language that surrounded the case. They remind us that the story did not begin with murder. It began with lives. And the tragedy was not that a famous mystery had been created. The tragedy was that ordinary people were lost. The mystery came afterward. The questions came afterward. The courtroom came afterward. The newspapers came afterward. The history books came afterward. For the people who died, there was no afterward. And perhaps that is the most important thought to carry into the rest of this story. Before we ask who was guilty, we should remember who was gone. Before we examine the strange beliefs, we should remember who suffered because of them. Before we study the psychology of the accused, we should remember that the victims had their own psychology, their own relationships, their own hopes, and their own futures. Those futures ended in 1941. The rest of the world continued. The seasons changed. The war that was consuming Europe continued to dominate international headlines. Canada continued its enormous wartime mobilization. Cities thousands of miles away were occupied with events that seemed vastly more important. But in the far north, families were burying their dead. The contrast is almost impossible to comprehend. While nations were discussing armies, battles, ships, and aircraft, a small Arctic community was dealing with a different kind of catastrophe. A catastrophe born not on a battlefield, but within the human mind. And somewhere in the records of the Canadian government, the case was being reduced to paper. Names. Dates. Statements. Charges. Sentences. The machinery of the state was beginning to transform human suffering into an official case. But the truth was still buried beneath layers of fear, belief, memory, and grief. The investigators had not yet heard everything. The courtroom had not yet opened. The accused had not yet faced judgment. And the full story of what had happened during that terrible winter had not yet been assembled. To understand it, we have to go back before the murders. Back before the accusations. Back before the 6 people stepped onto the ice. Back to the islands themselves. Back to the people who lived there. Back to the winter of 1940. Because the first chapter of the Belcher Islands tragedy was not written with blood. It was written with isolation. It was written with cold. It was written with uncertainty. And it was written in a community where the distance between one human being and another could be measured not only in miles, but in trust. Somewhere within that frozen world, Peter Salah and Charlie Uyarak began to occupy a position of unusual influence. Their religious claims became increasingly significant. The boundaries between spiritual belief and personal authority began to blur. And eventually, certain people were no longer viewed simply as neighbors who disagreed. They became enemies. Enemies of God. Enemies of the chosen. Enemies who, according to the beliefs of those who condemned them, had to be dealt with. The first deaths followed. Then Sarah. Then the ice. And only afterward would the outside world finally understand that what had happened on the Belcher Islands was not a collection of unrelated tragedies. It was a chain of human decisions. One leading to another. Until the chain ended with 9 dead. The question now is how that chain was formed. Who began pulling it tighter? Who followed? Who resisted? Who was afraid? Who understood what was happening? And when did the first person realize that this was no longer simply a matter of belief? That is where we must go next. Before the police arrived. Before the courtroom. Before the verdict. We return to the beginning, to an Arctic community facing another long winter, unaware that within its own circle, a dangerous new certainty was taking shape. A certainty that would soon demand something far more terrible than faith. It would demand obedience. And eventually, it would demand blood. The tragedy of the Belcher Islands did not announce itself with a scream. It arrived quietly. That may be the hardest part to accept. There was no single night when the entire community suddenly descended into chaos. No dramatic moment when everyone understood that something terrible had begun. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, through conversations, beliefs, suspicions, and decisions that may have seemed small when they were first made. That is often how the darkest chapters of human history begin. Not with a monster standing in the doorway, but with an idea. An idea repeated often enough that people begin to accept it. An accusation whispered until it becomes a certainty. A person who once seemed strange becomes dangerous. A person who once seemed dangerous becomes evil. And once someone has been placed in the category of evil, violence can begin to look like a form of protection. The Belcher Islands were an unlikely place for such a story to unfold. The islands lie in the enormous Hudson Bay, far from the major population centers of Canada. Today, the region is part of Nunavut. In 1941, it was a remote Arctic world where transportation and communication with southern Canada were difficult and unpredictable. The people living there understood distance in a way that people in cities rarely can. A journey was not simply a matter of checking a map and choosing a road. The weather could determine whether a journey was possible at all. The ice could open. The ice could shift. Visibility could disappear. A person could leave with confidence and return hours later exhausted, or not return at all. And in the winter darkness, the outside world could feel impossibly distant. That isolation created a particular kind of vulnerability. When a community has little contact with outside institutions, people rely heavily on those around them. They depend on family. They depend on experienced hunters. They depend on elders. They depend on people who appear to understand the world. And they depend on whatever spiritual framework helps them make sense of suffering, death, weather, hunger, and uncertainty. Religion can offer comfort in such circumstances. It can create meaning. It can connect people to one another. It can provide hope when the physical world offers very little of it. But religion can also become dangerous when an individual claims exclusive authority over spiritual truth and begins defining other people as enemies of that truth. That distinction would become central to the Belcher Islands tragedy. Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak did not simply hold unusual religious ideas. They became central figures in a movement whose beliefs eventually had deadly consequences. Uyarak was associated with claims of being Jesus. Salar was also connected with extraordinary spiritual claims. To understand the power of such claims, we need to move beyond the question of whether they were objectively true. They were not. The important question is what those claims meant to the people who heard them. A person who says, "I believe God is speaking to me," is making a statement about personal faith. A person who says, "I am the person through whom God is speaking, and anyone who rejects me is rejecting God," is making a claim of authority. That is something entirely different. The second statement places the speaker above ordinary disagreement. It turns disagreement into rebellion. And if the speaker is believed, the consequences can become enormous. Imagine living in a small community where the same people are around you every day. You see them when you leave your shelter. You encounter them during travel. You meet them through family connections. You share information because there is no vast outside network available to verify every rumor. If one influential person begins saying that certain individuals are dangerous, those accusations can spread quickly. A rumor does not need to travel through thousands of people. It only needs to move through a few. Then it can return to the original speaker as apparent confirmation. Someone says, "I heard that person is evil." Another responds, "I heard the same thing." The first person thinks, "Then it must be true." The second person thinks, "Everyone believes it." The belief becomes stronger because each person mistakes repetition for evidence. This is one of the most dangerous forms of collective thinking. And when supernatural explanations enter the equation, ordinary behavior can become terrifying. A person becomes sick. Someone behaves strangely. A child becomes frightened. Someone has a nightmare. A hunter returns with bad news. A family experiences a death. Instead of being understood as events with natural causes, they can be interpreted through a supernatural narrative. God is angry. Satan is present. Someone has been chosen. Someone else has been corrupted. Someone must be punished. Once such a framework becomes dominant, every new event can appear to confirm it. The death of one person does not end the fear. It can increase it. Because now the group has evidence, at least in its own mind, that the danger is real. The tragedy of Sarah Aporcock illustrates this terrifying process. She was approximately 13 years old. Nothing about that age should place a child at the center of a deadly theological conflict. Yet according to the surviving records, Sarah became associated with accusations involving Satan. The accusation itself is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. But the most important question is not whether the accusation was irrational. It clearly was. The question is how an irrational belief could become powerful enough to place a child in mortal danger. That requires us to understand the difference between private belief and collective conviction. A person can privately believe almost anything without immediately harming another person. The danger grows when that belief becomes social. When other people validate it. When authority reinforces it. When doubt is punished. And when the group begins to see itself as engaged in a struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. In such a world, compromise becomes impossible. You cannot negotiate with Satan. You cannot reason with evil. You cannot tolerate an enemy of God. And if a person has been defined as one of those enemies, violence can be reframed as righteousness. That is the psychological trap. The person committing the act may no longer experience themselves as the aggressor. They may see themselves as the protector. The executioner becomes the defender. The victim becomes the threat. And the more extreme the belief becomes, the more extreme the actions required to maintain it may seem. This is why the Belcher Islands murders should not be treated as a bizarre historical curiosity. The case is disturbing because its underlying psychological mechanisms are not confined to the Arctic. They are human. They can appear anywhere. They can emerge around religion, around politics, around conspiracy theories, around charismatic leaders, around movements that divide the world into people who are pure and people who are evil. The names change. The beliefs change. The circumstances change. But the mechanism remains recognizable. Someone claims special knowledge. Others accept it. A group forms. An enemy is identified. Fear grows. The group becomes isolated from competing explanations. The leader's authority increases. And eventually, someone pays the price. On the Belcher Islands, the price was paid in human lives. But the deaths did not all occur in the same way. Some were direct killings. Others resulted from actions that exposed people to deadly conditions. That distinction would later matter in court. Legally, the question was not simply, did someone die? The law had to ask who caused the death. What did they do? What did they intend? What did they understand? Were they capable of understanding the consequences? Were they acting voluntarily? Were they mentally ill? And could the court hold them responsible? These questions would become extraordinarily difficult because the evidence came from a world that Canadian courts were not accustomed to entering. The eventual trial would take place not in a major Canadian city, but on the islands themselves. A tent would be transformed into a courtroom. The judge would sit inside. People would gather to watch. Witnesses would speak about events that had taken place within their own community. And the accused would hear their actions described in legal language. But before that happened, the authorities had to get there. The RCMP had to cross the enormous distance between southern Canada and the Arctic. The investigators needed transportation. They needed communication equipment. They needed medical expertise. They needed to understand the physical environment. And they needed to investigate deaths that had occurred under circumstances unlike almost any ordinary Canadian criminal case. The very act of reaching the crime scene was an expedition. That detail matters because it tells us how long the victims were left without outside intervention. In a modern city, a suspicious death can trigger an immediate response. Police arrive. Paramedics arrive. Crime scene investigators arrive. The area is secured. Witnesses are separated. Evidence is photographed. Records are created. In the Belcher Islands of 1941, none of that could happen quickly. Time passed. The community continued living. People who knew the accused continued living near them. People who had lost relatives continued seeing the places where those relatives had once been. The environment continued changing. The evidence existed inside that passage of time. By the time investigators arrived, the story had already become history for the people who lived through it. And history is messy. Different people remember events differently. Some details become confused. Some details become exaggerated. Some details disappear. Some people may not want to speak. Others may speak because they want the authorities to understand what happened. And some may genuinely believe that their interpretation is the only possible explanation. The investigators would have to navigate all of this. But there was another challenge. The language used by authorities and newspapers at the time reflected the attitudes of the period. The word Eskimo appeared repeatedly in official and journalistic descriptions. Today, Inuit is the appropriate term in this context. That difference is not merely linguistic. The language used to describe a community can shape how outsiders understand it. Some newspaper accounts presented the Belcher Islands as an exotic and almost primitive place where strange beliefs had suddenly produced violence. That framing was convenient. It made the story easier to consume. It allowed readers thousands of miles away to think, that happened there because those people were different. But that explanation is too simple. It ignores the broader historical context. It ignores the profound changes taking place in Inuit communities through contact with missionaries, traders, and Canadian institutions. It ignores the pressures of isolation. It ignores the psychological effects of fear. And most importantly, it ignores the fact that violence is not an Inuit characteristic. The overwhelming majority of Inuit communities did not respond to religious change with murder. The Belcher Islands case was an exceptional tragedy involving particular individuals and particular circumstances. That distinction matters because true crime can easily become exploitative. When a story involves a marginalized community, sensationalism can turn victims into props and culture into a stereotype. That is not what happened here. The victims were people. The perpetrators were individuals. The community was more than the crime. And the historical context is essential to understanding what happened. The same principle applies to the accused. Calling them monsters may make for dramatic storytelling, but it does not explain their behavior. A monster is easy. A human being who becomes capable of terrible actions is much harder to understand. The records suggest that unusual religious beliefs and questions of mental state were central to the case. That means the story cannot be reduced to simple evil. The court itself would struggle with that question. And the eventual verdict would reflect that complexity. Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak were not sentenced to death. They were convicted of manslaughter. 2 years. Hard labor. A sentence that, from a modern perspective, can seem almost incomprehensibly light. But the legal system of 1941 was operating within its own framework. The court was not simply punishing the fact that people had died. It was assessing criminal responsibility. And the difference between murder and manslaughter mattered enormously. Murder generally implied a higher degree of intent and culpability. Manslaughter allowed the court to recognize that a death had been caused unlawfully without necessarily establishing the same degree of murderous intent. The mental condition of those involved also mattered. Mina's treatment by the court demonstrated how seriously questions of mental illness entered the proceedings. She was not simply treated as another ordinary criminal defendant. Her mental state became part of the legal understanding of what had happened. And that creates one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire story. If someone is genuinely convinced that a supernatural force has ordered them to act, and that conviction is rooted in severe mental disturbance, where does responsibility begin and end? The law has one way of answering that. Psychiatry has another. Morality has another. The families of the victims may have yet another. There is no single sentence capable of resolving all four. Perhaps that is why the Belcher Islands case still feels unresolved even though the court reached its verdict. The law closed the case. But history did not. History kept asking questions. What caused the religious movement to become so extreme? Why did certain people gain such authority? Why were some individuals targeted? Why did others follow? Why did the children end up on the ice? Could anyone have stopped it? Did anyone try? And what did the community do afterward? These questions are more difficult than simply identifying a killer. Because the real story is not only about individual responsibility. It is about a community caught inside a chain of events. And chains can be broken. At any point, someone might have refused. Someone might have spoken. Someone might have walked away. Someone might have recognized the danger. But we do not know exactly what each person understood at each moment. That uncertainty is part of the tragedy. We are looking backward with information that the people involved did not have. We know the ending. They did not. We know that the journey onto the ice would become fatal. They did not necessarily know that. We know that Sarah would die. She did not know that when she first became the target of accusations. We know that the RCMP would eventually arrive. The people living through the crisis did not know when help would come. This is what makes historical reconstruction so difficult. We have the advantage of hindsight. They had only the present. And their present was cold, remote, uncertain, and increasingly dangerous. By the time authorities reached the Belcher Islands, the story had already become a tangle of death, belief, fear, and conflicting testimony. The investigators had to untangle it. They had to find the people responsible. They had to determine what had happened to the dead. They had to distinguish direct killing from deaths caused by exposure. They had to understand the role of each accused person. And they had to confront a question that would become the heart of the trial. Were these people criminals who had deliberately chosen violence, or were they individuals whose minds had become so distorted by religious belief and psychological disturbance that they no longer understood the meaning of their actions? The answer would not be simple. And the courtroom on the island would become the place where Canada attempted to answer it. But before we enter that courtroom, we need to understand the people who lived in this frozen world. Because a murder case is never truly about the murderer alone. It is about the person who was killed. The person whose voice is no longer available. The person whose final moments must be reconstructed from whatever evidence survives. Sarah Aporcock was one of those people. So were Moses, Alec, Jonassy, Johnny, Nukarak, and Kamudluk Sarah. They deserve more than to be remembered as names in an unusual case. They deserve to be remembered as human beings who existed before the tragedy. They had relationships. They had families. They had daily routines. They belonged to a community. They had futures that were still unfolding. Then, during one extraordinary winter, those futures were taken away. And that is where we should pause. Not at the courtroom. Not at the verdict. Not at the strange claims of divine identity. But with the people who never had the opportunity to tell us what happened in their own words. Because before the Belcher Islands became a crime scene, it was home. And before these people became victims, they were simply living. The next part of the story begins there. It begins with the islands themselves. With the families who lived among them. With the traditions that shaped everyday survival. With the arrival and influence of Christianity. With the difficult winter of 1940 and 1941. And with the gradual rise of a religious movement that would eventually transform faith into fear. The murders did not begin when the first person died. They began earlier. They began when certain beliefs started changing the way people looked at one another. When a neighbor stopped being a neighbor. When a child stopped being seen as a child. When disagreement became evidence of evil. And when the voice of one person began to sound, to some listeners, like the voice of God. Only then can we understand what happened next. Only then can we understand why people followed. Why people resisted. Why people died. And why, when the RCMP finally arrived, they found themselves investigating not simply a series of murders, but the collapse of trust inside an isolated Arctic community. The frozen landscape had preserved the silence. Now the investigators would have to make the silence speak. To understand the Belcher Islands murders, we have to slow down. The first part of the story is easy to rush through because we already know where it is going. We know that people will die. We know that accusations will turn into violence. We know that police officers will eventually arrive and that a courtroom will be erected in one of the most remote corners of Canada. But the people who lived there did not know any of that. For them, the Belcher Islands were not the setting of a future true crime story. They were home. And home, in a place like this, meant something very different from what most people today imagine. There were no paved roads stretching toward the horizon. No electric streetlights glowing after sunset. No row of houses connected by sidewalks. No convenience store a few minutes away. No hospital waiting for someone who had fallen ill. No police car that could arrive after a phone call. The islands belonged to a much larger world of ice, water, wind, darkness, and distance. They lay deep within Hudson Bay, surrounded by an environment that could appear almost empty to an outsider but was anything but empty to the people who knew it. Every ridge of land mattered. Every channel mattered. Every change in the ice mattered. A hunter who had lived in that environment for years could read details that a stranger might never notice. A change in the color of the snow. A subtle crack in the ice. The direction of wind. The movement of animals. The shape of a pressure ridge. The appearance of clouds over distant water. Knowledge like that was not written in a manual. It was learned through experience. It was passed between generations. And in the Arctic, that knowledge was not merely useful. It was survival. The world of the Belcher Islands demanded attention. A person could not simply assume that yesterday's conditions would still exist today. The ice was never completely trustworthy. The weather could change. A route that had been safe could become dangerous. A successful hunting trip could turn into a struggle for survival. Distance had weight. Cold had weight. Every decision mattered. That reality shaped the psychology of the people living there. When survival depends on careful observation, uncertainty becomes something you learn to respect. But during the winter of 1940 and 1941, uncertainty was everywhere. The season was harsh. Food was not always easy to obtain. Travel was difficult. And the normal pressures of Arctic life were compounded by the isolation of the community. To understand what that isolation meant, imagine what it would feel like to know that the nearest major centers of Canadian authority were hundreds of miles away. If someone became seriously ill, there was no simple way to transport them south. If a violent incident occurred, there was no guarantee that police could arrive quickly. If a dispute became dangerous, there was no nearby institution capable of immediately separating the people involved. The community had to survive largely through its own internal structures. Families cared for families. Experienced individuals helped others navigate difficult conditions. Traders and company employees provided connections to the outside economy. Missionaries and religious teachings introduced ideas that had traveled thousands of miles to reach the Arctic. And government authority existed in the background, but its physical presence was limited. This created a strange combination of closeness and isolation. People could be deeply connected to one another, yet almost completely disconnected from the outside world. A rumor could travel quickly through the community. Official information could travel incredibly slowly. That difference would become important. Because when unusual religious beliefs began spreading among some people, there was no modern media environment capable of immediately challenging or contextualizing them. There was no internet. No television. No radio network constantly broadcasting competing explanations. No outside psychologist. No emergency crisis team. The information available to people came from those around them and from the institutions that had reached the region. That included the Hudson's Bay Company. By the 20th century, the Hudson's Bay Company had become one of the most important commercial institutions in northern Canada. Its trading posts were not simply places where people bought and sold goods. They could function as points of contact with the outside world. Information passed through them. Supplies passed through them. Messages passed through them. Company employees could become some of the few people in the region with direct communication links to authorities farther south. In a remote community, that made a trading post more than a store. It could become a bridge. And when the Belcher Islands tragedy eventually came to the attention of the Canadian authorities, that bridge would matter. But in 1940, no one looking across the frozen landscape could have known how important that connection would become. The community was still living its ordinary life. People still hunted. Families still cared for children. Travel still followed the rhythms of the seasons. And religion was already part of that world. Christianity had not arrived overnight. Its influence in Inuit communities had grown over decades through missionary work, trade, government policy, and cultural contact. For many Inuit, Christianity became woven into existing ways of understanding the world. But cultural change is rarely simple. When a new religion enters a community, it does not simply replace everything that came before it. People interpret it. They adapt it. They combine ideas. They ask questions. They reject some teachings and accept others. Different individuals can emerge from the same religious environment with very different beliefs. Some may find comfort. Others may feel confused. Some may become deeply committed. Others may remain skeptical. And occasionally, an individual can interpret religious teachings in an intensely personal way. That appears to have happened in the Belcher Islands. The beliefs associated with Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak became increasingly unusual. They were not merely repeating familiar religious teachings. They were associated with extraordinary claims about divine identity and supernatural forces. Uyarak was described as believing or claiming that he was Jesus. Salar was also associated with claims of special spiritual status. To understand why such claims mattered, we have to remember the social environment in which they were made. In a large modern society, a person claiming to be Jesus might be dismissed as eccentric. Within a large city, thousands of people may never even hear the claim. But in a small and isolated community, an unusual belief can have a very different trajectory. The person making the claim is not an anonymous stranger. They may be someone others know. Someone they have seen before. Someone whose personality, confidence, or reputation gives their words greater influence. And if several people begin to believe the claim, a small movement can form. The movement does not need thousands of followers. It only needs enough people to create an environment where the belief becomes socially powerful. That is exactly what makes isolated communities psychologically complicated. Closeness can create solidarity. But closeness can also amplify conflict. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone knows who belongs to whom. Everyone knows which families support which ideas. Everyone notices who attends which gatherings. In such an environment, disagreement cannot easily remain private. It becomes visible. And once disagreement becomes visible, it can become dangerous. The religious movement around Salar and Uyarak appears to have divided people according to their acceptance or rejection of extraordinary spiritual claims. Those who believed could see themselves as part of something special. Those who rejected the claims could be viewed with suspicion. And gradually, the language of religion became intertwined with the language of danger. This is where the story begins to move from unusual to frightening. Because a belief can be strange without being violent. A person can sincerely believe something irrational and never harm another human being. The danger emerges when the belief creates an enemy. When the group decides that someone is not merely mistaken, but evil. And according to the historical accounts surrounding the Belcher Islands case, accusations involving Satan became part of that process. The word itself carried enormous power. Satan was not simply another person. Satan represented ultimate evil. So when a human being was associated with Satan, the accusation could transform that person from a neighbor into an existential threat. That is how Sarah Aporcock became vulnerable. She was young. She had little power compared with the adults around her. And she became associated with a supernatural accusation that could not be tested through ordinary evidence. There was no scientific examination that could prove whether someone was connected to Satan. There was no rational test. The accusation depended entirely upon belief. And when belief becomes the only evidence, the accused person is trapped. Nothing they say can necessarily free them. If they deny the accusation, they can be accused of lying. If they cry, their fear can be interpreted as guilt. If they become angry, their anger can be interpreted as proof of evil. If they remain silent, the silence can be interpreted as concealment. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Once the accusation has been accepted, everything the accused person does can be used against them. This is one reason historical accusations of supernatural evil have so often produced terrible consequences. The accused is no longer treated as an individual with a complicated life. They become a symbol. And symbols are easier to destroy than people. The Belcher Islands community was not immune to these psychological forces. But it would be wrong to imagine that everyone accepted the beliefs. There were disagreements. There were different interpretations. There were people who did not share the same religious convictions. That diversity is important because it reminds us that the tragedy was not inevitable. Nothing about the environment guaranteed that murder would occur. Nothing about Inuit society made it inevitable. Nothing about Christianity made it inevitable. The deaths resulted from decisions made by particular people in particular circumstances. The environment created pressure. The beliefs created a framework. The individuals made choices. And the combination became catastrophic. The winter itself intensified the pressure. In the Arctic, hunger is not simply an unpleasant sensation. Hunger changes behavior. It reduces strength. It increases stress. It can make people desperate. A community dealing with unreliable food supplies is a community operating with less emotional and physical reserve. Every setback matters more. Every death hurts more. Every conflict becomes more serious. When the physical environment is already demanding everything from you, psychological instability can have greater consequences. The winter of 1940 to 1941 was therefore more than a backdrop. It was part of the atmosphere in which these events unfolded. The cold narrowed the world. The darkness narrowed it further. Distance narrowed it again. People lived close together because survival required cooperation. But closeness also meant that there was little privacy. A disagreement could spread. A religious argument could become a community issue. A strange behavior could become a rumor. And once a rumor began moving, it could become difficult to stop. Imagine the uncertainty of hearing that someone has been identified as dangerous. You know the person. Perhaps you have known them for years. But suddenly people are looking at them differently. Perhaps someone says that the person has a connection to evil. Another person repeats it. A third person says that they have heard something similar. The story grows. The evidence remains invisible. But the fear becomes visible. People begin to change their behavior. They watch. They listen. They avoid. And eventually, someone may decide that action is necessary. That is how social pressure can transform a belief into a physical threat. The Belcher Islands case appears to have followed such a progression. By the time the first known killings occurred, the religious conflict had already moved beyond theological disagreement. People had become targets. 3 Inuit people were killed during the earlier violence associated with the movement. The exact sequence of events is difficult to reconstruct with the certainty we would expect from a modern case. The historical record is incomplete. Contemporary accounts sometimes used sensational language. Later sources sometimes condensed several events into a single narrative. Even the number of victims was initially confused in some reports. Some newspapers suggested much higher numbers than the 9 deaths eventually established by investigators. This uncertainty is important. It reminds us that the version of the story we know today was constructed from incomplete evidence. The people investigating in 1941 had to work with what survived. And what survived was shaped by distance, weather, memory, and the limitations of communication at the time. Still, one fact became clear. People were dead. And the deaths were connected. The most shocking discovery would involve Sarah. On or around January 25, 1941, at a camp on Flaherty Island, Sarah Aporcock was killed. She was approximately 13 years old. The circumstances surrounding her death were linked to the religious accusations circulating among the group. To understand the significance of that moment, imagine what it meant for the community. A child had been killed. Not by an unknown outsider arriving from somewhere beyond the bay. But in the context of a conflict within the community itself. That changes the nature of fear. When danger comes from outside, people can unite against it. When danger comes from inside, trust begins to collapse. The person beside you may be safe. Or they may be part of the group you fear. The person who says they are protecting you may actually be making you less safe. And the person who disagrees with them may be the one trying to stop the violence. Once that inversion occurs, ordinary social instincts become unreliable. You can no longer assume that authority is protective. You can no longer assume that the group is safe. You cannot even assume that a religious gathering is merely a religious gathering. Every meeting can carry another meaning. Every accusation can become a threat. Every silence can become frightening. And then came March. The 6 people who would die on the ice became part of the growing tragedy. Their deaths were different from the earlier killings, but they emerged from the same atmosphere of extraordinary belief. A woman named Mina became associated with the events. Accounts describe her as suffering from severe religious and psychological disturbance. She persuaded people to leave shelter and travel onto the frozen Hudson Bay. The precise beliefs surrounding the journey vary in surviving descriptions, but the central image remains remarkably consistent. People were led away from safety into the Arctic cold because they expected something to happen. A revelation. A religious event. The arrival of Jesus. The fulfillment of a prophecy. Something that, in their minds, justified the journey. But the ice did not respond to belief. The temperature did not rise because they expected salvation. The distance back to shelter did not become shorter because they believed they were protected. The children who followed the adults were still vulnerable to cold. The elderly were still vulnerable. The human body remained human. And the Arctic remained indifferent. By the time the danger became undeniable, it was too late. 6 people died. 6 lives ended not because the ice itself was evil, but because human beings had made a decision about what the ice meant. That distinction is at the heart of the entire case. The environment was dangerous. But danger alone does not kill. Human decisions determine whether we enter the danger. Whether we stay. Whether we turn back. Whether we bring protection. Whether we listen to someone warning us. And in the Belcher Islands tragedy, the most devastating decisions were decisions made under the influence of belief. After the deaths, the community was left with a terrible reality. There were now multiple deaths. There were accusations. There were people who knew something had happened. And yet the outside world remained distant. The authorities were not immediately there. The police were not immediately there. The courtroom did not yet exist. The case was still trapped inside the community. Somewhere, however, the first information began moving toward the outside world. A trader associated with the Hudson's Bay Company helped bring the situation to official attention. That act would eventually set in motion an investigation unlike anything most RCMP officers had ever encountered. The government would begin planning a journey north. Aircraft would become part of the response. Doctors would be involved. Radio communication would be necessary. And police officers would prepare to enter a place where the normal rules of criminal investigation had to be adapted to the Arctic. But before the aircraft arrived, the people of the Belcher Islands had to live with what had happened. They had to look at the empty spaces left by the dead. They had to remember the children. They had to confront the fact that the violence had come from within their own community. And perhaps most painfully, they had to wonder whether the tragedy could have been prevented. That question has no easy answer. It is tempting to imagine that someone could simply have stepped forward. That someone could have said no. That someone could have stopped the leaders. But human beings rarely recognize the full danger of a situation while they are inside it. The final outcome is visible only after the chain has been completed. At the beginning, each link may seem small. A strange claim. A religious gathering. A disagreement. An accusation. A threat. A punishment. A death. Then another. And suddenly the chain is too strong for anyone to break easily. That is the world we are entering now. A world where the landscape was unforgiving, where communication with the outside was limited, where religious ideas were changing the way some people understood one another, and where a handful of individuals would eventually gain enough influence to help turn belief into deadly action. The Belcher Islands were not simply cold. They were isolated. They were not simply isolated. They were vulnerable. And within that vulnerability, a dangerous certainty was growing. The people who believed themselves to possess special spiritual knowledge were beginning to decide who was good and who was evil. Once that decision was made, the next question was unavoidable. What should be done with the people judged to be evil? The answer would come in blood. And the first person to pay the price was a child. The child at the center of the accusation was not living in a world divided neatly between innocence and evil. She was living in a community. A community where people knew one another, where families were connected through generations, where survival required cooperation, and where the meaning of a person's actions could depend heavily on what others believed about them. That is important because the Belcher Islands tragedy did not emerge from an empty landscape. The land was harsh, but the society was not. There was warmth inside shelters. There were families. There were conversations. There was laughter. There were children growing up with the expectation that they would one day become adults and take their own place within the community. The landscape that looks so barren in photographs was, to the people who lived there, filled with memory. A particular stretch of coast could be associated with a hunting trip. A particular camp could carry the memory of a family member. A particular route across the ice could have been traveled countless times. The Arctic was not an empty wilderness. It was a lived-in world. And that makes what happened there even more disturbing. The tragedy did not take place because civilization was absent. It took place because, within a functioning community, a dangerous set of beliefs and personal influences began to overpower ordinary safeguards. The people of the Belcher Islands had ways of surviving the physical environment. They knew how to read the land. They knew that nature demanded respect. They knew that an apparently safe journey could become dangerous. But there are forms of danger that cannot be read from the color of the sky. You cannot always see psychological instability approaching. You cannot always recognize manipulation. You cannot always tell when spiritual conviction has crossed into delusion. And you cannot always know when a person who claims to be protecting the community has begun to endanger it. That kind of danger is invisible. It travels through words. It grows through repetition. It becomes powerful through trust. And once enough people accept it, it can begin to change reality. Not the physical reality of the ice or the temperature, but the social reality of who is considered safe, who is considered dangerous, who deserves to be heard, and who can be ignored. This was the environment in which Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak became important. The historical record does not provide us with a perfect psychological portrait of either man. We cannot sit across from them today and ask what they truly believed at every stage of the events. We cannot reconstruct every conversation. We cannot know every private thought. What we do know is that their names became deeply connected with the religious movement and the violence that followed. Uyarak, in particular, was associated with claims of divine identity. The idea that he was Jesus was not a minor detail. It gave his words a level of authority that ordinary people could not possess. If someone tells you they are simply offering an opinion, you can disagree. If they tell you they speak for God, disagreement becomes more complicated. And if they tell you that rejecting them means rejecting God, disagreement can become frightening. The psychological power of such a claim lies in its ability to close the argument before it begins. There is no need to prove the claim if the believer already accepts the speaker's authority. And there is no neutral ground. You either believe, or you are placed on the other side. This creates what psychologists would describe as a closed belief system. Inside such a system, outside evidence can actually strengthen the belief rather than weaken it. If someone challenges the leader, the challenge becomes evidence that enemies are attacking the truth. If authorities intervene, their intervention becomes proof that the group is being persecuted. If something goes wrong, the failure can be blamed on insufficient faith. The belief protects itself. Every contradiction is reinterpreted. Every doubt becomes a test. Every warning becomes an attack. That is how a movement can become increasingly isolated from reality without its members necessarily realizing that they are becoming isolated. The world outside says one thing. The group says another. Eventually, the group trusts itself more than the outside world. In a remote Arctic community, the physical isolation could make this process even more intense. The distance between the islands and southern Canada meant that outside institutions were not constantly present to challenge or interrupt the movement. A person could not simply walk into a police station and ask an officer to intervene. There was no immediate court. There was no psychiatric facility nearby. There was no emergency response system. If someone believed that a spiritual leader was dangerous, they had to navigate that danger within the community itself. And that required courage. It required social independence. It required the ability to stand against people who might be family members or friends. Not everyone could do that. Not everyone would even recognize that it was necessary. Fear changes perception. When a group becomes convinced that an invisible enemy exists, people begin looking for signs of that enemy. A strange expression. An unusual dream. A disagreement. A person refusing to attend a gathering. A child behaving differently. A person becoming sick. All of these things can be interpreted as evidence. The accusation involving Satan illustrates this process. Once someone has been identified as connected with supernatural evil, almost anything can be interpreted through that lens. The accusation becomes bigger than the person. And the person becomes smaller than the accusation. This is especially dangerous when the target is a child. Children depend upon adults. They have less social power. They may not understand why they are being accused. They may not have the language or authority to defend themselves. They may assume that adults know what they are talking about. That makes a 13-year-old particularly vulnerable to an accusation that adults have already accepted. Sarah Apporcock's death therefore represents more than one of the killings connected with the case. It represents the moment when an abstract belief became attached to the life of a child. The idea of Satan was no longer something discussed in theological terms. It had been given a human target. And once that happened, the target could be treated as though destroying them were an act of protection. This is one of the darkest transformations in human behavior. Violence is rarely described by the person committing it as violence when they believe they are acting for a higher purpose. They may call it purification, protection, justice, punishment, sacrifice, defense. The vocabulary changes. The physical act does not. A person still suffers. A person still dies. The distinction exists in the mind of the perpetrator, not in the body of the victim. That is why the later court proceedings would have to examine not only what happened but what the accused believed they were doing. The legal system could not simply look at the final outcome. It had to look at intent. And intent is hidden. It exists inside the mind. The court could only approach it through words, actions, testimony, and circumstances. That is why the earlier months of the story matter so much. The investigators needed to know how the beliefs had developed. They needed to understand the relationships between the people involved. They needed to determine whether certain individuals were acting independently or under the influence of others. And they needed to understand what happened before the deaths. Because a person does not suddenly become capable of extraordinary violence without some preceding chain of events. The chain may be short. It may be long. It may involve personal conflict. It may involve psychological disturbance. It may involve ideology. It may involve fear. In the Belcher Islands case, it appears to have involved all of these elements to some degree. But there was another force shaping the community. The outside world itself was changing. The year was 1941. The Second World War was raging. Canada was deeply involved. Thousands of miles away, governments were making decisions that would affect millions of people. Aircraft crossed oceans. Ships moved through dangerous waters. Armies fought across continents. The scale of those events was almost unimaginable from the Belcher Islands. For the people living there, the war existed mainly as distant information. Their immediate concerns were much closer. Food. Weather. Family. Travel. Health. Faith. Survival. That contrast reveals something important about history. Major historical events do not erase local realities. A war can dominate newspapers while a family somewhere in the Arctic worries about whether a relative will return from a hunting trip. A government can debate national policy while an isolated community deals with an internal crisis that few people outside the region even know exists. The Belcher Islands murders unfolded within that gap. To most Canadians, the islands were remote. To the people who lived there, they were the center of the world. And when tragedy struck, it was not an isolated curiosity. It was an event that affected the entire community. The loss of one person changes the rhythm of a family. The loss of several people changes the rhythm of a community. People begin counting who is missing. They remember the last time they saw someone. They remember where they were supposed to go. They remember what was said. They look at familiar places differently. And when the deaths involve violence, there is an additional layer. Fear. Grief is not the only emotion. There is suspicion. People begin wondering who knew what. Who was present? Who had followed whom? Who might be dangerous? Who might be telling the truth? The community can become divided between those who believe one explanation and those who believe another. That division can last long after the immediate danger has passed. This is one reason the arrival of the RCMP would be so significant. The police represented an authority outside the immediate social structure. They were not family members. They were not part of the religious movement. They were not dependent upon local approval. They arrived to ask questions. And sometimes, simply asking questions can disrupt a closed belief system. Why did this person die? Who saw them last? What happened before they died? Why were they there? Who told them to go? What did you believe would happen? These are simple questions. But when a community has been living inside fear, simple questions can be powerful. They force people to separate what they know from what they believe. They force witnesses to distinguish what they personally saw from what someone told them. They force the story to become specific. And specificity is dangerous to rumors. A rumor can survive because it is vague. Evidence must be precise. Who? When? Where? How? Why? The investigators would begin assembling those answers. But first they had to reach the islands. The journey itself reflected the limitations of the era. Aircraft were essential. Radio communication was essential. Medical support was essential. The people traveling north were entering an environment where a mechanical failure or sudden weather change could become a serious threat. This was not simply a police operation. It was an Arctic expedition with a criminal investigation attached to it. And the investigators were about to discover that the physical environment was only half the challenge. The other half was human. They would have to speak with people who were grieving. People who were afraid. People who held unusual beliefs. People who might have participated in the events. And people who might not trust the authorities. The investigation would also take place within a colonial context. The Canadian government was not an invisible neutral presence in Inuit life. Government policies, commercial interests, missionaries, and southern institutions had been reshaping northern communities for years. That history matters when outsiders arrive and begin asking questions. An investigator may believe he is simply enforcing the law. A local person may see something more complicated. They may see another representative of a distant government entering their community and judging behavior according to rules developed elsewhere. That does not mean the investigation was illegitimate. The deaths still needed to be investigated. The victims still deserved justice. But historical context helps explain why the relationship between the authorities and the community could not be completely simple. The Belcher Islands case sits at the intersection of several worlds. Inuit community life. Christian religious influence. Canadian law. Colonial administration. Traditional knowledge. Modern criminal investigation. Psychological disturbance. And the brutal physical reality of the Arctic. None of those elements can be separated completely. If we remove the environment, we lose the importance of isolation. If we remove the religious context, we lose the motive behind much of the violence. If we remove the colonial context, we risk misunderstanding the relationship between the community and the state. If we remove the victims, We turn a tragedy into an intellectual puzzle. And if we remove the psychological dimension, we lose the question of why people who may have believed they were doing something righteous became involved in deadly actions. That is why this case demands patience. It cannot be understood in one sentence. It cannot be explained simply by saying that the perpetrators were crazy. It cannot be explained simply by saying that they were religious fanatics. And it cannot be explained simply by blaming the environment. The truth is more uncomfortable. Human behavior rarely fits into one box. A person can be influenced by belief and still make choices. A person can suffer from mental illness and still affect other people's lives. A person can be manipulated and still participate in harm. A person can be frightened and still hurt someone else. And a person can believe they are saving others while actually destroying them. That complexity would become central to the legal proceedings. But the courtroom was still months away. The winter was still present. The community was still living with the dead. And the authorities had only begun to understand that something extraordinary had happened. The first reports reaching the outside world were confusing. Some accounts suggested far more deaths than the investigation would eventually confirm. This is understandable when information travels slowly through multiple people, across enormous distances, under difficult conditions. But sensational reports can create their own reality. Far away, readers could imagine an enormous massacre. A remote Arctic settlement. Dozens of bodies. A strange religious cult. A mysterious leader. The story had all the ingredients of a newspaper sensation. Yet the reality was more complicated and, in some ways, more disturbing. There were 9 confirmed deaths connected to the events. Not dozens. 9. But 9 is not a small number when every death represents a person. And the fact that several were children makes the number even more painful. The 6 who died from exposure on the ice were not simply anonymous victims of the environment. They were people who had been placed in a situation that their bodies could not survive. The earlier victims were not merely casualties of some vague religious disturbance. They were individuals who had been targeted. The distinction between these forms of death would matter later. But to the community, the emotional reality was simpler. People were gone. And everyone wanted to know why. One of the most haunting aspects of the story is the possibility that some of the people involved believed that nothing terrible would happen. That is essential to understanding the journey onto the ice. People do not normally take children into deadly conditions because they want those children to die. If they believed the journey would bring salvation, revelation, or the arrival of a divine figure, then their decision may have appeared meaningful to them. That does not erase responsibility. It does not erase the deaths. But it changes the psychological question. The question becomes not only, why would someone deliberately expose people to death? It becomes, what would someone have to believe in order to think that death was not the likely outcome? That question takes us deep into the psychology of religious delusion. A delusion is not simply a strange idea. For the person experiencing it, it can feel completely real. Evidence that contradicts it may not weaken it. Instead, the person may reinterpret the evidence. A delay becomes a test. A failure becomes a sign. A warning becomes persecution. A tragedy becomes proof that the prophecy is unfolding. This can create a terrifying feedback loop. The more reality contradicts the belief, the more the believer may search for another explanation. And if other people accept the same framework, the belief becomes socially reinforced. The 6 people on the ice may therefore have been walking through a world in which the ordinary rules of cause and effect had been replaced by another logic. But the Arctic does not operate according to human belief. The cold does not negotiate. The wind does not compromise. The body cannot survive indefinitely without warmth simply because someone promises that salvation is coming. That collision between belief and physical reality is perhaps the most tragic image in the entire case. People walking toward something they believed would happen. And the physical world moving inexorably toward the opposite conclusion. By the time the truth became unavoidable, the consequences could no longer be reversed. The children were dead. The adults were dead. The survivors were left behind. And the community had to face the unbearable question of what had just happened. Then came the authorities. The arrival of the RCMP would change the character of the story. Until then, the tragedy belonged almost entirely to the community. Afterward, it became a criminal investigation. The dead became evidence. The living became witnesses. The accused became suspects. And the beliefs that had once existed inside people's minds became subjects of legal examination. The investigators would begin asking questions. They would travel between camps. They would examine what could be examined. They would speak with witnesses. They would gather information. They would attempt to separate fact from rumor. And eventually, they would identify the people who would face the Canadian justice system. But justice would not come quickly. The Arctic had its own timetable. Weather could interfere. Transportation could fail. Distances could delay everything. And even after the investigation was completed, there remained a deeper problem. What kind of justice was appropriate for people who had acted within a world of extreme religious belief and psychological disturbance? The answer would not come from the ice. It would come from a tent. A judge would eventually sit there. A jury would listen. Witnesses would speak. And the names of the dead would be spoken again. But before that moment, there was still one part of the story we need to understand. The victims. Because the most respectful way to enter a true crime story is not by staring at the accused. It is by remembering the people whose lives were taken. The names that survive tell us something. Moses was 13. Alec Umaraluk was 8. Jonassy was 6. Johnny Cockpuck was 7. Nukarak was 55. Kumudluk Sarah was 32. Sarah Aporcock was approximately 13. Those ages are more than numbers. They reveal the range of lives destroyed. A child just beginning adolescence. Another barely old enough to understand the world. A 6-year-old who should have had decades ahead of her. A 7-year-old whose future had barely begun. An older man with a lifetime of experience. A woman in the middle of adulthood. And another young girl caught inside an accusation she could not control. They were not a single category. They were a community's people. And their absence would be felt differently by everyone who knew them. A parent might remember a child's face. A sibling might remember a laugh. A friend might remember a conversation. Someone else might remember the last time they saw the person alive. History gives us names and dates. Memory gives us everything else. The problem is that memory fades. That is why these records matter. Not because they make the story sensational. Because they prevent the dead from disappearing completely. The Belcher Islands tragedy happened more than 80 years ago. The people who lived through it are now gone or elderly. The world around them has changed. Technology has transformed the Arctic. Communications are faster. Transportation is different. Government institutions have changed. The community itself has changed. But the underlying questions remain. What happens when fear becomes certainty? What happens when a leader claims supernatural authority? What happens when a child is labeled evil? What happens when people follow a belief into physical danger? And what happens when the law arrives after the damage is already done? Those questions are waiting. But before we answer them, we need to understand the victims as people. We need to step away from the killers. Away from the courtroom. Away from the strange religious claims. And look at the human beings whose lives existed before the case ever had a name. Because every investigation begins with a death. But every death begins with a life. And the next chapter of this story belongs to those lives. The Belcher Islands in winter could make the world feel smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because human life was concentrated into a handful of places where people could find shelter, food, companionship, and protection from the elements. Larger because beyond those places stretched an almost unimaginable expanse of ice, snow, water, and sky. A person could stand outside and see no obvious boundary between the earth and the horizon. There might be no road, no tree line, no distant city, nothing that told the eye where one world ended and another began. For someone arriving from southern Canada, the landscape could appear empty. For an Inuit person who had grown up there, it was full of information. The land spoke through patterns. The ice revealed changes. The snow recorded movement. Animals left signs. Weather announced itself in subtle ways. A skilled hunter could look at conditions that an outsider considered meaningless and understand whether travel was safe. This knowledge was accumulated over generations. It was not theoretical. It was practical. It was the difference between returning home and disappearing. That relationship with the environment shaped everyday life. People could not afford to treat the Arctic casually. A mistake that might be inconvenient somewhere else could become fatal there. If you underestimated the cold, you could lose the use of your hands. If you traveled too far from shelter, a storm could trap you. If you misjudged the ice, the consequences could be immediate. The physical world demanded discipline. But the human world demanded trust. And trust was just as important. A hunter needed to know that others would understand the plan. Families depended on one another. Children depended on adults. Travelers depended on people who knew the route. Information had value. Experience had value. Authority had value. That is why the emergence of charismatic religious figures could have such profound consequences. When a person claims to possess knowledge that others do not have, they are offering more than an opinion. They are offering certainty. And certainty can be intoxicating. Especially when life is uncertain. The winter of 1940 to 1941 was difficult. The people of the Belcher Islands already understood hardship. They were not strangers to hunger or cold. But difficult conditions can reduce the margin for error. A family with enough food can survive a bad hunting day. A family already struggling may not. A person with strength can endure a long journey. A person weakened by hunger may not. A community under pressure becomes more sensitive to loss. Death is not abstract. It is immediate. It can change the balance of a family. It can leave children without support. It can alter the survival prospects of everyone connected to the dead person. This means that every death carries consequences beyond the individual. When several people die within a short period, the entire social structure can begin to feel unstable. And that is precisely what makes the Belcher Islands case so important to understand as a community tragedy. It was not simply a sequence of murders. It was a breakdown. A breakdown in trust. A breakdown in judgment. A breakdown in the ability to distinguish danger from safety. And eventually, a breakdown in the boundary between religious belief and violence. The influence of Christianity must also be understood carefully. Christianity had become established in many northern communities through missionary work and long-term contact with European and Canadian institutions. For many Inuit, Christian teachings became part of their religious lives. But cultural change did not happen in a straight line. People did not simply wake up one morning and abandon everything they had previously believed. Religious ideas interacted with existing traditions, family structures, experiences, and interpretations of the world. Different individuals understood Christianity differently. Some accepted missionary teachings closely. Some adapted them. Some resisted them. Some combined elements of different ways of understanding the world. That process could create complicated religious landscapes. The Belcher Islands were part of that changing world. The people living there were not cut off from Christianity. But neither were they simply southern Canadians transplanted into the Arctic. Their lives were shaped by their own community and environment. The result was a cultural world that could not be reduced to a single category. This matters because later newspaper descriptions often tried to do exactly that. The tragedy was presented as strange, exotic, remote, sometimes almost unbelievable. The distance itself became part of the story. Readers far away could imagine a mysterious Arctic island where strange people had done strange things. But that perspective could obscure the human reality. The people involved were not characters in a myth. They were human beings living within a specific historical moment. They had families. They had responsibilities. They had fears. They had disagreements. They had beliefs. And they made choices. Some of those choices would have consequences that nobody could reverse. Among the most important figures were Peter Salar and Charlie Uyarak. Their influence did not appear overnight. The available historical record is not detailed enough to reconstruct every step of their rise. But by the time the killings occurred, they were central enough to the religious movement that their names became inseparable from the investigation. Uyarak was associated with the belief that he was Jesus. That claim is extraordinary. But the psychological significance is even more important than the words themselves. If a person genuinely believes they are Jesus, they may no longer see themselves as subject to ordinary authority. Why should they obey a local leader? Why should they accept a challenge from another person? Why should they acknowledge that they could be wrong? If their identity is connected to divine authority, disagreement becomes more than disagreement. It becomes defiance. And when other people accept the same belief, the leader's authority becomes even stronger. The group can begin functioning according to an entirely different hierarchy. The normal social structure remains outside. But inside the movement, another structure has emerged. The leader speaks. Followers listen. Doubt becomes weakness. Opposition becomes danger. And eventually, someone is labeled an enemy. This pattern has appeared in many societies. It does not belong to one culture. It is not uniquely religious. Human beings have repeatedly formed groups around charismatic leaders who claim special knowledge or special authority. The danger increases when the group becomes isolated. Isolation reduces competing information. If everyone around you believes the same thing, their agreement can feel like proof. The Belcher Islands were already physically isolated. The religious movement added another form of isolation. Psychological isolation. A person could be surrounded by other people and still live inside a completely different interpretation of reality. This is why the case is so difficult to understand from the outside. To us, the beliefs can seem obviously irrational. But the people inside them did not necessarily experience them as irrational. The human brain does not label every false belief as false. If a belief is emotionally powerful, socially reinforced, and connected to a person's identity, abandoning it can feel like destroying part of themselves. And if abandoning it also means losing the support of the group, the cost becomes even higher. That is how certainty becomes a prison. The person believes because everyone else believes. Everyone else believes because the person believes. The circle closes. And inside that circle, an accusation can become almost impossible to challenge. This is where the accusation involving Satan becomes crucial. The idea of Satan already existed within Christian theology. But the dangerous step was taking that abstract concept and attaching it to an individual human being. Once Sarah Apporcock became associated with that accusation, she was no longer being judged simply as Sarah. She was being judged as a symbol. And symbols are dangerous because they can erase individuality. If someone is simply Sarah, you can see her as a child. You can ask whether she is frightened. You can wonder what she wants. You can feel sympathy. But if she is described as an agent of Satan, the emotional response changes. Fear replaces empathy. Suspicion replaces curiosity. The accusation creates psychological distance. And once enough distance exists, violence becomes easier to imagine. This does not mean every person involved felt no compassion. Human beings can hold contradictory emotions. A person can believe someone is dangerous and still feel affection for them. A person can be frightened and still hesitate. A person can obey while privately doubting. That complexity is important. Because the historical record does not give us access to every person's private thoughts. We should not invent them. We can reconstruct what happened from surviving evidence. But we must distinguish fact from interpretation. That is particularly important in a case surrounded by sensational reporting. Some early accounts dramatically overstated the scale of the deaths. The final confirmed number was 9. That number matters. It provides a boundary between the historical record and the rumors that surrounded the case. 9 people died in circumstances connected to the religious crisis. Not dozens. Not an entire village. 9. But the fact that the number was relatively small should never make the tragedy sound smaller. Imagine one family losing a child. Then another. Then another. Imagine a community realizing that the deaths are connected. Imagine wondering whether the person responsible is someone you know. Imagine hearing that religious accusations may have played a role. Imagine knowing that the authorities are hundreds of miles away. Imagine looking across the frozen bay and understanding that there is no quick escape. Fear in such a setting would be different from fear in a city. There would be nowhere to disappear into a crowd. Everyone knows the community. Everyone knows the camps. Everyone knows who is connected to whom. A person might not be able to simply leave. Even if they wanted to, where would they go? The environment itself creates barriers. And so the social world becomes intensely important. Who has authority? Who has influence? Who is trusted? Who is feared? Who can protect you? Who can harm you? These questions become matters of survival. And as the religious movement became more influential, those questions became increasingly difficult. The people associated with the movement could present themselves as spiritually powerful. Others could see them as dangerous. The community could begin dividing along lines that were not simply religious. They became lines of trust. One person believed. Another rejected the belief. A third person was uncertain. A fourth person was afraid to say what they thought. That fourth category may be the most important. Because silence does not necessarily mean agreement. Sometimes silence means fear. Sometimes it means confusion. Sometimes it means a person does not know whom to trust. And in a community where people have to continue living together, silence can be a survival strategy. The first killings changed that balance. Once people had been killed, the possibility of violence was no longer theoretical. It had become real. And real violence changes how people interpret every future threat. If someone says, "This person is dangerous," the community can no longer dismiss the statement as mere rhetoric. Someone has already died. The fear has evidence. Even if the reasoning behind the accusation is false, the consequences are real. That is how violence can reproduce itself. The first act creates fear. Fear makes accusations more believable. Accusations create new targets. New targets create more violence. And each new death reinforces the belief that something extraordinary is happening. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. By January, Sarah's death had become part of that cycle. By March, the 6 deaths on the ice had expanded the tragedy beyond direct killing. And by the time authorities were informed, the community was already carrying the weight of several deaths. The physical landscape had changed too. The winter was advancing. Snow-covered tracks. Ice-covered water. The world looked almost untouched. That visual appearance can be deceptive. The Arctic can preserve a sense of silence even after terrible events. A person can look across the horizon and see nothing that tells them what happened there. No buildings may mark the place. No permanent monument may exist. No crowd may gather. The landscape simply continues. That is one reason historical crimes in remote places can be so haunting. The location does not necessarily look like a crime scene. It looks like nature. But nature remembers nothing. People do. The memories belonged to the survivors. They belonged to the families. They belonged to the witnesses. And eventually, they belonged to the investigators. When the RCMP began preparing to travel north, they were entering a world where their conventional methods had to adapt. They needed to determine what evidence could survive the environment. They needed to understand local geography. They needed interpreters and communication support. They needed to identify people who could explain the relationships within the community. And they needed to be careful. A police investigation can create fear even under normal circumstances. In an isolated community, the arrival of armed outsiders carrying official authority could feel overwhelming. People might not know what the police wanted. They might not understand the legal process. They might be uncertain about what would happen to witnesses. They might fear punishment. They might fear retaliation. And they might simply be unfamiliar with the procedures being introduced. The RCMP therefore had to operate within two worlds. They were enforcing Canadian law. But they were also entering an Inuit community with its own history, relationships, knowledge, and social structure. The tension between those worlds would become part of the larger story. Yet there was no way around the investigation. The dead required answers. And the families deserved to know what had happened. The first task was to establish the basic facts. Who was dead? Where were they? How had they died? When? Who had seen them last? The answers would begin forming a picture. 3 people had been killed in the earlier violence. Sarah had been killed at a camp on Flaherty Island. 6 more had died from exposure after going onto the ice. The total came to 9. But the number did not explain the mechanism. Who caused each death? Who ordered anything? Who followed? Who participated? Who was mentally capable of understanding the consequences? These were separate questions. And they required separate answers. The investigation would therefore become increasingly focused on individual responsibility. Peter Salar, Charlie Uyarak, Mina, and others who had become involved in the religious movement. The investigators would have to understand the relationships between them. They would have to listen to witnesses. They would have to distinguish between direct action and influence. That distinction would later become crucial in court. A person does not necessarily need to physically kill someone to be responsible for a death. But proving responsibility requires more than showing that they were present. The law needs evidence. And evidence requires facts. This is where the strange nature of the Belcher Islands case becomes almost paradoxical. The story sounds like a supernatural mystery. But the investigation was intensely practical. Police officers needed names, dates, locations, statements, physical evidence, medical conclusions. They needed to reconstruct events from fragments. The same fragments that had once been part of people's lives now became pieces of a legal puzzle. A conversation. A journey. A body.